Welcome to Washington in Focus Daily. It is Monday, April 20th, 2026. I'm Carlene Johnson, the Center Square's state government reporter. And in today's episode, the Center Square has an exclusive with public disclosure documents obtained by my colleague TJ Martinell, our Center Square Washington investigative reporter, concerning crafting of the recently passed income tax or the millionaire's tax, depending upon which side of that you come down on. TJ received nearly 1,000 pages of documents through a public records request from the Office of State Attorney General Nick Brown, showing communications between the AG's office and majority Democrats as they were considering how to craft Senate Bill 6346, the legislation that ultimately became our state income tax law signed by the governor. And knowing apparently it was an unconstitutional tax, there was a lot of back and forth between the AG's office and majority Democrats and others. It was an exclusive by the Center Square and TJ Martinell to receive these documents, and it is pretty shocking and explosive. And this is no doubt going to open up a giant can of worms, not only for supporters who, how they're going to respond to this, but for opponents. And there's already, as you probably know, a legal challenge filed, as well as an effort to get a referendum moving forward. That effort, the Secretary of State has objected to, and we're waiting for the state Supreme Court to weigh in at the end of this month as to whether or not they're going to allow a referendum to move forward, which would give the public an opportunity to say, once again, how they feel about the income tax. And then along these same lines, it's apparently dominating town halls and other campaign appearances for Senator John Braun, Republican minority leader from Centralia. You may be aware he is running for Congress, trying to make that step up to federal office. And as he's been out on the campaign trail in recent weeks and months, the income tax is dominating a great deal of those discussions. People talking, he told me, a lot about affordability, a lot about the income tax. Of course, those things are interrelated. So we're going to share some of his thoughts along those lines. I have reached out as well to the incumbent, Representative Marie Glusenkamp Perez, for comment on this, specifically about the Senator Braun's comments about the income tax, because there hasn't really been any public comments that her camp has made about where she comes down on this. If in fact I receive a response from her, that will be included in tomorrow's episode. Either way, I'm going to be writing on that. And you can find a story coming up on Tuesday's page of our Center Square Washington website. We're also at the very scary place, according to Representative Travis Couture, who's the Republican and budget lead on the House side. He says, if you ask supporters, Washington's new income tax isn't really all that bad compared to other states like Idaho. We have one side from the Economic Opportunity Institute weighing in on that, and what Representative Couture's thoughts are on that. He really believes we're on the cliff in this state, where so many Washingtonians, whether you're a business owner or you work for somebody else, that we're really on a fiscal cliff here in this state. And it's now or never as far as turning things around in the state of Washington before we really put ourselves in a dire place. And my colleague Tim Klauser then has a story going back to COVID vaccine mandates. Wasn't that a fun time for everybody? Remember, the first responders, and many of us as well, even in the private sector, were told that we had to get the jab or we were going to lose our job. It was the jab or the job, right? A lot of us held out, and thankfully, some of us didn't end up having to get the vaccine, but others lost their jobs over it. Many first responders did, whether they were firefighters, whether they were, nurses, doctors, a lot of students in medical school had to make a really tough decision. Well, since then, there have been a number of lawsuits, and there is one still in the works from some firefighters in Snohomish County whose case may end up being heard by the U.S. Supreme Court. So my colleague Tim Klauser is going to share some of the interview that he did today along those lines. So let's jump into today's episode of Washington in Focus. Because it's a big day at the Center Square with my colleague TJ Martinell, our state investigative reporter, getting a hold of nearly 1,000 pages of public records from the Office of Attorney General Nick Brown. Now, his beat is normal public disclosure requests. He's always putting these out as an investigative reporter. You want to find out what people are talking about behind the scenes. Oftentimes, it takes, putting in these FOIA requests, Freedom of Information Act requests, or public disclosure requests, PDRs, to get these documents back. So he's doing that all the time. He received probably the doozy of all doozies as far as public records requests back last Friday regarding the income tax. And it revealed more than he would expect to gain normally. I think that's part of what he shared with me. Here is part of my conversation earlier today with the Center Square's investigative reporter, TJ Martinell.
Yeah, so I asked for any communications and legal advice regarding the Senate version of the bill and also the House version of the bill. And what I received the other day was 988 pages of public records. And what it contains is internal communications within the Attorney General's office, communications with lawmakers, communications even with the governor's office regarding the legality of a millionaire's tax, which imposes a 9.9% tax on the income of people who make $1 million or more annually. And so, what was interesting about these records and fascinating is the the framing of the bill's purpose was very explicitly, in no uncertain terms, was to overturn the 1933 Colleton decision, which declared that income was property under the state constitution. Now, some people might wonder why that matters. Well, because uh, the voters back in the 30s tried to impose a progressive income tax, and what the Supreme Court said was you can't do that because we have a state constitutional amendment that says that property taxes have to be uniform in nature, they can't exceed 1%, and that rate is determined by class. And so also we have a definition of property that's defined to be all things tangible and intangible subject to ownership. So ever since then, the state Supreme Court has unanimously and consistently ruled that income is property under our 14th Amendment in the state constitution. What they're saying in these emails, both members of the Attorney General's office and state lawmakers, is this bill is being crafted in a way so that it will force the state Supreme Court to address the Colleton decision and determine once again, after so many Supreme Court rulings, after so many voter voters rejecting an income tax, whether or not income is property. And so what it means is that this bill is not intended, this millionaire's tax is not intended to generate revenue for whatever programs they're doing. Its purpose, its true purpose, its primary purpose is to overturn almost a century's worth of legal precedent in which the Supreme Court at one point said it is no longer a question to this court whether income is property.
So you can believe there will be much more to come on this exclusive story in the days and weeks to come. On our Center Square Washington page, TJ's article today revealing his discovery and the exclusive documents he obtained. I would recommend you check that out. And we're going to have continuing reaction this week from state lawmakers on both sides of the aisle, from some policy folks that are weighing in, supporters and opponents of the income tax, as well as the legal team fighting all of this. Citizen Action Defense Fund has secured former state AG Rob McKenna, as well as former state Supreme Court Justice and state lawmaker, Democrat Phil Talmadge, leading the effort, along with some folks we've introduced to you on previous episodes of Washington in Focus Daily, for the legal challenge filed in Klickitat County Superior Court against the income tax. I have no doubt that TJ's discovery and the documents he has obtained are going to be part of this legal argument moving forward. So we are excited about the opportunity to share a lot more on that in the days to come. And now, Senator John Braun, Republican from Centralia, current Republican leader in the Senate, is looking for a promotion. He is hoping to unseat Democratic incumbent Representative Marie Glusenkamp Perez in the 3rd District. That's in Southwest Washington. I spoke with him this morning about how the campaign is going, fundraising, as the incumbent has outpaced him at this point, even though he has the endorsement of President Trump, and what people are talking to him about on the campaign trail. Of course, he's running for federal office, but he's, been a state lawmaker for many years and has a prominent position as the state minority leader. He said he goes out on these campaign events and everything everybody wants to talk about is affordability or lack thereof in Washington. And the income tax, he said, is of great interest.
It is the top issue when I go to talk to people, and whether it's as a legislator or as a candidate for Congress, the top issue people bring up is the state's income tax, and we haven't heard a peep from my opponent on this tax, what she thinks about it, whether she's willing to push back with her colleagues in the Democratic Party and say this is wrong for the state of Washington. But I can tell you, overwhelmingly, this is very unpopular. Nobody believes that it's going to stay on high earners. Everybody understands that this is the first step, and the next step is to reduce the deduction so that everybody pays this in the future.
I did reach out to the incumbent's office, Representative Marie Glusenkamp Perez, for comment on this. If they respond, I will include that in tomorrow's episode of Washington in Focus Daily, as well as further comments from Senator Braun. As you know, she's got a bigger war chest at this point, and with 6.5 months to go in the campaign, and you can bet that campaign ads are going to start fast and furious, I'm sure, over the summer. Um, it's going to be interesting to see how the race plays out. She has far more money at this point, but he's hoping that there's going to be some folks stepping up, especially given how high profile this race is. That district, that third district, is a purple district. It can really go either way. And as far as members of U.S. Congress are concerned, they believe this is a winnable race, and that's why he has the endorsement of President Trump. But it's going to come down to the final months of this campaign. Okay, still speaking of the income tax, it seems like that's all we talk about, right? We told you last week about a new report from Mountain States Policy Center about how over the last 11 years, Idaho has slowly ratcheted down its income tax. They did that initially just as a percentage, and then last year in 2025, they went to a flat rate so that everyone is paying the same percentage. Of course, you're going to pay more if you make more money, but everyone is paying a flat and what many consider to be a fair rate for an income tax. So last week I spoke with Annie Kuklik at the Economic Opportunity Institute. They are one of the big champions of the income tax. And she told me that Washingtonians who will pay the income tax, those for now making more than $1 million or a combined household income over $1 million, at least at first, are in much better shape than people in other states like Idaho that already have an income tax.
I've done some research on, there's some maybe misleading headlines around the quote unquote marginal tax rate of 9.9%. And I did some research just to determine the effective tax rate for people who would have to pay this. And, if you are a household who is making $1.2 million and you might have to pay this tax, you would actually be paying the lowest effective tax rate of all the states that levy an income tax. So I think that's something else to hold on to, right? Like when you're thinking about this, we have to think beyond just the marginal rate. We have to actually think about the effective rate, the amount based on your income that you'd be paying. And yeah, it would increase with your income, right? Effective will depend on like taxation divided by total income. So if your income increases, that rate will go up. But for a $1.2 million household in Washington state, they'll be paying the lowest effective tax rate regardless still, right? So
Right.
yeah, I think that's kind of an interesting.
Now, as Mountain State's policy report noted, Idaho's income tax being lowered over the last 11 years has generated more revenue, not less. So, important to keep in mind, they ratcheted down the threshold for the income tax, and yet the income tax itself has brought in more money each time they have done that. So, something perhaps for policymakers, supporters of income tax in Washington to keep in mind, assuming it's upheld in the courts. Also, important to keep in mind when you do the comparison between Idaho and Washington, it's not really a fair comparison because Idaho doesn't have a B&O tax. They don't have climate commitment act taxes that impact us at the gas pump to the tune of more than 50 cents every gallon. They don't have payroll taxes and many of the other burdensome taxes that we have in Washington. So when you're considering the overall tax burden on state residents, Idaho versus Washington, you can't simply look at the income tax in a vacuum. You really can't. So Representative Travis Couture, who offered an alternative budget proposal, his budget was to proposal, which was not considered by majority Democrats, was an attempt to expand the working families tax credit. Now, remember, for supporters of the income tax, that is one of the main things that they've said. This is going to help us. If we can push the income tax over the threshold, we're going to expand the Washington working families tax credit big time. You might even be able to make a very decent income and you're going to get a bigger, tax return back. Of course, that's attractive to a lot of people. Now, Representative Couture's tax proposal was to use some of those Climate Commitment Act dollars instead to pay working families tax credit, an expansion of the working families tax credit. That was his proposal. As I mentioned, didn't go anywhere. But he says it's really important to remember that the return on taxes in our state is diminished because, as we've talked about a lot, jobs are leaving, high income earners are leaving. If the income tax is upheld in the courts, it is likely that we will see more of that. And many of us also, he says, because of the burdensome tax rate that we're already under with all these other crushing taxes, we have less discretionary income. We spend less out to eat. Most of us do anyway, not my teenagers. And we buy fewer, large dollar items. We maybe hold off on the purchase of a new vehicle and, try to limp our current vehicle along because we can't afford, higher taxes. So he says it's important to keep all of that in mind. And he really believes that we are at the tipping point here in Washington state when it comes to that tax burden.
As a state, we educate, medicate, and incarcerate. Those are the three big caseload buckets. And when we stop having an ability to pay for those in our courts because we've torched our economy, guess what? One of two things will happen: devastating cuts for the things that people need, in which will probably spur more tax increases on you, and it will just double the pain and make it all worse. Or the problems will just exacerbate to where they have to ratchet down an income tax into the middle class, which is exactly what will happen. By 2031, 2032, they will be ratcheting that income tax down, and then they will sell it like, oh, we're just shifting things around. We're going to get rid of some regressive taxes, but they will never truly go away. We will still have a carbon tax. We'll still have a gas tax. We'll still have sales tax. We'll still have B&O tax. And that's because one core element of all of this, and this is the heart of it all, we have a spending addiction in Olympia. We can't stop. And if you give someone who's addicted to something more drugs and booze to consume, in this case, more tax dollars, they will keep spending it. And so until they learn their lesson to live within their means and stop recklessly spending and curb the growth, extreme growth of state government, we will always need this money. We'll always run predictable deficits. And we just won't get it because we're hitting the Laffer curve where we see diminishing returns. The opposite idea, the alternative idea, my idea, is instead to create an environment where we have a great economy where you can grow, where you can build housing, where you can develop things. That means predictable, steady, low taxes to give people the ability to go and do what they do best, and that is build out Washington. That helps every single person in the state of Washington, and it grows the revenue pie quite significantly so that we have the revenue to pay for the essentials of government. And at the same time, we need to focus on the priorities of government, focus on those essentials, and stop sending money for wasteful programs that don't deliver any results. It's not rocket science. You just got to have people with the willpower to do it.
And now to a story from my colleague Tim Clauser, who is our Eastern Washington correspondent, but he also covers a lot of statewide issues. And this is a pretty big story that he covered today. There are 8 firefighters who were working at Snohomish Regional Fire and Rescue who, during the COVID mandates for vaccines, requested religious accommodations. You remember many people, and maybe many of you, sought either a medical exemption or religious exemption or both from your employer, such that you did not have to get the COVID-19 vaccine. Many of us had objections to that. Many folks ended up leaving their jobs. We've talked a lot about that as well. So now Snohomish Regional Fire and Rescue obviously rejected these 8 employees' request for a religious exemption. They have fought this through the courts. They have lost through the district court process, but now there is a request for the U.S. Supreme Court to weigh in on this. And they have taken up some other appeals for the COVID-19 vaccine mandate issues. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens. So here is my colleague, Tim Clauser, and his discussion today with an attorney who's representing these 8 clients in their case that will hopefully be considered by the U.S. Supreme Court.
Their claim was we needed to protect the safety of people around them. And so the fire department said, hey, we've got this pandemic going and we're afraid or concerned that they're going to make other people sick when the firefighters are not vaccinated. So even though they could, take extra precautions like mask up and that sort of thing, we're not going to allow that because there's an extra bit of risk and we're not sure that. So that's the characterization of the court.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is these firefighters went and worked in nearby districts that did accommodate them. So nearby fire departments and nearby other organizations, and there was no problem. There was no issue. And not only that, but Snohomish engaged in these mutual aid agreements where, so let's say there's an emergency and they send fire department, they'll also send, an ambulance, or a neighboring fire department will send their own vehicle. And those people were not required to be vaccinated. So they've got their own firefighters who they required to be vaccinated, shoulder to shoulder with other workers that were not vaccinated, or at least they had no way of knowing one way or the other if they were. And if the danger was really so great, then Snohomish would not have done that. But instead, Snohomish, or what they call servers, Snohomish Regional Fire Department, they said, no, this gives us an excuse to lay off these firefighters because they won't get vaccinated, even though they were placing their own employees in the same scenarios that they would be in around unvaccinated workers. So the way we see this is there was no real justification for holding them out for 8 months. And the Ninth Circuit held, well, but they had a reasonable concern that there might be an undue hardship. Whereas, if they're in a different circuit, no, they actually have to prove that someone would have in fact been harmed in order to justify not granting the accommodation. And we know they can't prove that because nothing happened. All these individuals went to nearby fire departments and worked for the whole 8 months that they were laid off. And then at the end of the 8 months, Snohomish Fire Department brought them back. And so all these guys that were laid off for 8 months then came back. They were never required to be vaccinated. And so, well, clearly you're able to accommodate them because you did accommodate them 8 months later. And yet still the Ninth Circuit said, no, we're letting them completely off the hook because they had a reasonable concern. And we think that's insufficient. We think, and now that there are 3 circuits on one side and 3 circuits on another, we just want the Supreme Court to clear that up and to say whether reasonable concern is sufficient or if the employer has to prove more. And we believe the employer has to prove more.
So Tim's story is up at the Center Square Washington page. I encourage you to check that out. And for much more on all this income tax and our exclusive with TJ and all the breakout that we know is going to come fast and furious between, well, probably now and about an hour from now. Thanks for watching. Join us again for tomorrow's episode of Washington in Focus Daily.